The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation. Formosa Files.
Welcome to Formosa Files. I'm Eryk Michael Smith, and we've got an interesting subject for you today. You are very charitable, Professor Moskowitz. You call it dancing for the dead, but it's a little bit more like erotic dancing, perhaps?
Yes, it is erotic dancing, but there's a lot more that goes into it. There's a lot of singing, great singing that I think would be comparable to some of the pop stars. And the difference is, I think Taiwan's pop music industry tends to draw from kind of urbanites. It draws from elite people to middle class, at usually elite though, to be honest, people with family connections. And so a lot of the performers in the electric flower car industry, which is what the funeral strippers are associated with, a lot of them are working class. And so this is the option, the venue that's open to them if they are very talented singers or dancers.
Interesting. Okay, we'll get back to this electric car thing, but I should introduce you properly. You are a professor of anthropology at the University of South Carolina. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I've been there about 18 years now, I guess.
One of your interests was Taiwan and specifically death rituals. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, my dissertation advisor was David Jordan, and he worked on religious studies in general. So my first book was on the belief in abortion ghosts in Taiwan, and then I went on to do more popular culture oriented stuff like popular music, the game of Go. And now this new project, I think, combines those interests of popular culture and religious studies to some degree, because this usually occurs in religious venues, whether that is funerals or temple events and these kinds of things.
How long were you here?
I lived in Taiwan, I guess if you add it all up, about 10 years. I was there 5 years straight from 94 to 99. And then, I was there a couple of years on Fulbright, and then every summer pretty much. So a big chunk of my life at this point.
Awesome. So when people hear funeral and, okay, I'll just say the word stripping, their first reaction is probably, this is some sort of a parody, some sort of you're joking, right? Okay, and I've been here for a really long time as well. I've never seen this in a downtown city. I have been at some weddings where there were some dancers who were scantily clad, but when I came across your documentary, I mean, it didn't shock me, but it was like, I don't think I've heard of this. So, okay, the obvious first question is, who are they stripping for?
These are all good questions. Before I started doing the research, I hadn't really seen it either. I'd also been living in urban environments, Tainan and Taipei, but I had heard about it from pretty much everybody I knew. And I think the reason that you and I had not seen it before is that there had been some government restrictions that try to push it outside of city limits, precisely because urbanites are often offended by it. I think people living in cities, middle class, are very, very much invested in what you might say is a global ethos People are very much looking abroad to the West and other areas, Japan, and saying, what would they think of this? On the other hand, I don't know anybody in Taiwan, any Taiwanese person in Taiwan who's not seen it, who's not aware of it. So it's still pretty prevalent. It's just been pushed out of urban centers to some degree.
Yeah, I mentioned it to a Taiwanese friend, and they were like, "Yeah, a little bit embarrassed, but a long time ago. Don't do that anymore." But
Yeah, yeah.
again, who is it for? If it was to cheer up the poor people who are grieving because of the lost loved one, okay, I can see that. But it's not for that.
Good. Well, I wouldn't discount that completely. I mean, depending on who you talk to, people talk about it being for the gods. There are high gods and low gods in Chinese religion, and so it's thought that low gods have kind of all the tastes that we do. If we think about Greek gods, they're much closer to them. They're greedy. They like to sleep around. They like to gamble. They like to smoke. Um, as opposed to high gods, which Guan Yin and Mazu and these people who would disdain for this. Other people said it was for the ghost. The ghost either of the newly deceased or ghosts in general to distract them so that they're not kind of picking on the new ghost. One person said that to me. But also as a form of free entertainment. Um, in rural areas, most people cannot afford to go to big pop concerts, or they're not, it's far enough away. It's kind of it's a big deal to go. And so these performers set up at temples and religious events and give what for the audience is free performance. They usually charge the temple, or they charge the family of the deceased, or they charge a friend of the deceased who paid the money for this. So who watches this is pretty widely interpreted, depending on who you talk to.
It sounds like it's a form of respect in a way, like either the family to the deceased, because they're paying a lot of money for this.
Absolutely, I think it's absolutely a form of respect. It's a form of conspicuous consumption.
Mhm.
Uh, because your name goes on it. So if you pay for an electric flower car, your name goes there. Everybody knows who paid for it. So it's a way of saying, hey, I've got the money to spend on the community. And it's a way to celebrate community rather than individualistic nature of life. It started out, I mean, most people say it started out around 1980 is when it became super popular. It was around long before that, but 1980, and at this time, Taiwan's economy was really booming. It seemed like people were getting rich out of luck as much as hard work at that particular moment.
Yep.
And it was a time that the gangsters were doing pretty well for themselves. So this started with gangster culture and kind of spread from there. And so the disreputable element was in some ways, but precisely because of the origins of who was paying for it, who was celebrating in these ways. And that's continued today to some degree, I think.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting you to say, in the late stage of the Tang Dynasty, there was,
Yeah.
yeah, this
Well,
sounds like something.
I did. I stumbled on some documents. There was mention of in 1895, I think it was mention of by government officials criticizing the practice, but they were talking about strippers at religious events and funerals. So
Japanese?
again, this has gone. I'm sorry, what?
Japanese officials?
I
1895?
think they were. Yeah, I guess they were Chinese officials working within the Japanese. They were Chinese people, officials working within the Japanese colonial era. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And they were on the outskirts. These particular cases were, I think, Penghu Island. So kind of separated from the Japanese colonial, not separated, but distance beyond the eye of, in the same way that provincial areas in China, there was a saying of, the farther you are away from the eyes of the emperor, the more you could get away with things.
I would be fascinated to see what an exotic dancer from 1895 looked like.
Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine it'd be very similar, but with different instrumentation. These days, it's a lot of pre-recorded music from the United States. There's techno music that people dance to. There's music that they sing, and that is like anything from Anka to Taiwanese songs to American hits that have been translated into Chinese. So there's a pretty wide range of things, but I'm guessing the actual performative nature of it may not have been all that different, really.
Okay. So electric flower cars. We're gonna, for the people who are watching this on video, we're gonna show some of your documentary called Dancing for the Dead, and they'll be able to see exactly what we're talking about. But for people who are listening only, what are these electric flower cars? They sound like some trippy LSD stuff from the 60s.
Yeah. Well, no, I think, back in the old days when it was drawn by an ox cart, they would decorate funeral processions with real, literal flowers. And by the 1980s, they were more decorations, ornate decorations around a vehicle that might be anything from the size of, say, a UPS delivery van. And then in the 90s, they started building diesel trucks that did this. So there's a pretty wide range of vehicles, but the name is kind of an homage to a time before there were gas-driven vehicles involved in this practice.
So who profits the most from the electric flower cars and the entire shebang?
I mean, I think that people who make an income from it are the people who have who have their own electric flower cars. These manager owners who, they invest thousands and thousands of dollars into the vehicles. So it's a business, but it's an entertainment business, much like the pop music industry is an entertainment business, or funeral wailers are an entertainment business. To that degree, I think there's these crossovers are familiar territory. It's just the actual stripping that becomes kind of a salacious point of objection for a lot of people.
The stripping, from what I saw in your documentary, did not quite come to the level of what I've experienced at certain wedding events. They weren't getting exactly naked.
No, I mean, there's two factors there. One is the documentary is primarily temple events, and I said that in the description, but I think I wasn't clear enough in the narration, so a lot of people misunderstand that. Two, I think me being there with a camcorder, people were restrained. They saw me there in the. I'm 6'2", white guy. I stand out, right? I'm the
Yeah.
only one in the audience. They notice me. And then I think that another factor to this is, well, I guess no, I guess those would be the main points about this. I didn't include absolutely everything I saw. There was one instance where I saw a woman go into an audience and start massaging a man's penis, for example. I had a lot of accounts of full nudity orally in interviews. People talked about that all the time. I did see a woman a couple of years ago. I did some follow-up interviews, and I went to a performance where I saw a woman very briefly flashing her breasts at the audience. And even there, I think, they were being a little restrained because I was there. So I think my presence influenced their performances in these ways. It is. It is shifting. I think when I did the interviews in the last couple of years, um, people said it's not as common at funerals anymore, and then when it does take place at funerals, they're more reserved. So I'm guessing, that basically means full nudity may being phased out in these events.
Yeah.
Um, and people did talk about at weddings. It's basically it's just not going on as much anymore. The younger generation isn't as invested in this. They're more interested in global culture as well, even in rural areas. But in temple events, people told me this is still going on. It's still out there. Again, beyond the eyes of urbanites like us, I think.
And the pushback, I'm thinking from anyone from feminists to the wife or relative of the deceased, no?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, there's an odd alliance between feminists and I get the argument there. I confess I've never been to a strip club before I did this project. I have my own puritanical tendencies. I confess. Um, and then there's this uncomfortable alliance with conservatives who think that women and children should be protected from seeing such things, and it's very much a paternalistic kind of, we need to keep morality in check by keeping these public events away. But let's be honest, a lot of these same politicians they're going to hostess bars. They're doing things that are pretty much the same. It's just out of the public eye. And so I think a big part of the debate, it appears to be a debate about morality, but I think it's more a debate about what is and is not perceived to be appropriate public behavior.
You were sort of taunted on camera, or how would you
Yeah.
describe it?
I mean, often when I was filming, people would introduce me to, I think having an American professor there filming and gave a certain validity to the event. There was a certain symbolic capital associated with that. But I think the case you're referring to in the film was this wonderful humor expressed by the female host. And she'd be like, "Do you love it? Do you eat some Chinese chicken?" Which was, essentially talking. It was a sexual metaphor. And so she was having fun of it. She drew me in to be part of the entertainment. And I think that became evidence of the ways that these performances are far more than just the funeral stripping, right? She was stepping in to make performances when she saw audiences were losing interest for one reason or another, and she'd step in and make it lively in these ways. So she was very witty about it, unusually witty, but being brought into the conversation and being part of the performance, standing in the audience, was pretty normal, in fact.
So, no offense, but nobody was just like, this is a perverted guy filming here.
Yeah, no, I had always introduced myself. I'd arranged to do the filming. I'd always let them know who I was and what I was doing, and asked if I could attend one of their performances. So the performers and the managers always knew I was there. There were a couple instances where they said, "Okay, we'll tell you when to stop filming," and I always respected that.
Hmm.
So I never just popped up unannounced, because this is kind of on the gray area of legal and illegal behavior, right? And so
Yeah.
I didn't want to get in any trouble. Earlier, I mentioned that I edited some things out, the woman rubbing the penis, for example, and I think talking about it means that no one person could get in trouble for it. And so I wanted to be as careful as I could about respecting people's boundaries and making sure that I didn't get anybody in trouble inadvertently. So
Yeah.
am
So
I a
the
pervert? Do they think I was a pervert? I guess that part of the question. I didn't mean to. I sound like a politician skirting the issue. Um, I think in that venue, I think they don't think of it as perverted. I think
right,
they
right.
it's
This is our
outside.
problem, isn't it? This is our
Yeah, no,
Western
I think
hang
so.
up.
I think so. And I think this is the challenge in anthropology. We try to look at practices in other countries. This dates back to 1930s. Margaret Mead, and she talked about different ways of handling puberty, for example, different cultural nuances about what we think of as a natural event, but actually being very culturally bound. She suggested that at that time, Samoans didn't undergo the emotional turmoil of puberty because everyone knew they were going to be fishermen and farmers, and they all had the same religion. There wasn't a lot of stress, as opposed to American puberty, where you might go to Thanksgiving dinner and you've got four different political spectrums, four different religions at
Mm.
that represented in your family, and you don't know who you're going to be. You don't, so this is all culturally bound. Anthropology looks at other ways of looking at the world. And part of what we're asking is, well, is what I think natural? And so, we think of funerals as a somber event. We pay reverence through quiet, but that's terribly culturally bound, right? That
Yeah.
extends to things like going to museums. And in fact, most of those paintings sat in living rooms of people having parties and getting drunk and doing all kinds of naughty stuff, right? But we associate respect with quiet. But that's not true everywhere. There's an old documentary, Dead Birds, and I think it was in Papua New Guinea, that people celebrate and they wail and they cry and they have almost warlike ceremonies on this. If we think about the Irish wake, the way that
Yep.
people kind of get drunk as part of it, there's something going on. I forget what country in Africa, but it was it's very similar. They have a whole party. They call them disco funerals, and there's a whole there's no actual disco music, but they take money from the entire community and they throw a party to celebrate the person's life as part of the passing.
I
So I
would
think,
definitely vote for that over a
yeah,
normal funeral for myself.
yeah, sign me up. I like the idea of the celebration of the life. Sign me up in whatever form that takes. If anybody wants to hire an electric flower car for me when I'm gone, go for it. I'd be honored to have that happen.
We'll do our best.
Okay.
So, would you be willing to go as far as to say it's actually a cultural heritage that should be preserved?
I think that's certainly what performers are saying. I think people are. I interviewed a couple of years ago. They were pointing out, Japan has, its pop music and its musical traditions and all kinds of performative things. Thailand, one person pointed out Thailand has the lady boys, and that's kind of part of Thai culture, right? And love it or hate it, electric flower cars are a very unique phenomenon, and something that existed in Taiwan. Now, I think in recent years, they've kind of been co-opted by the state. So the government is hiring stage cars, the diesel truck versions of these things, the really big versions of these things. And they're sanitizing them. So you don't see any stripping, but you see singing. The stage cars are smaller versions from the diesel trucks, so they're less expensive. They're not as impressive, but they're clearly modeled off the same stuff. And so the government, I think, has been incorporating this as a local tradition while trying to kind of sanitize it from the more scandalous parts of the performance.
Yeah, it strikes me as sort of a religious innovation or an evolution in religion that is unique to Taiwan.
I think so, and again, the idea of celebrating is part of a larger ethos. In Taiwan, of course, there's this concept of hot and noisy, and hot and
Runao.
noisy. Yeah, Ronald, exactly. And hot and noisy is basically the idea that anything to be remembered and worthy of thought as a community should be full of noise and firecrackers and all kinds of stuff going on. So if we were to subtract electric cars from the equation and go to an event, there's still movies being shown and people shouting and Buddhists on stage singing sutras and other forms of singing. There's funeral wailers at funerals. And so this is part of the ethos. And we have this in the West as well, in America, for example. You wouldn't want to go to a rock concert and have everyone sedately in their seats and politely applauding. You want it to get a little rowdy. You want people to get drunk and whatever else and dance and have fun and stand on the seats or jump on stage. That you want that excitement. But hot and noisy in Taiwan, I think, extends to everything. I mean, if you go down to Kunming at the beach, the section where people are supposed to be swimming is always loud music blaring, and you have these I forget what you call it, jet skis. Is that
Yeah, the
jet
irritant of my
ski?
life.
Yeah, oh no, yeah, but for me, beach is where you go to get away from it. It's quiet, but again, this ethos. I remember going up to the mountain of Alishan, and same thing. At that time, there were speakers blaring, and it was
People hiking up the mountain, Monkey Mountain in Kaohsiung, with a little radio blaring the music as they hike.
yeah, yeah, no, exactly. So I think there's just a different sensibility about what it means to get together with friends, and a sensibility that anything, birthdays and funerals and weddings and going to the beach and going to the mountains, all have to have this energy of hot and noisy. And in that context, funeral stripping makes a lot more sense, right?
Hmm. But you did also witness sadness, grieving.
Yeah, of course. I think this is a distraction. It's a way of, instead of wallowing in your sorrow,
Hmm.
of taking a minute to get away from it all. And I think Taiwanese culture, like Chinese culture, like some segments of American culture, certainly in my generation, um, people don't like to show emotion in public. Uh, so it becomes a way, and having been to funerals in the US, I could say people don't always know what to say, right? They're overwhelmed. How do you console somebody about something that is inconsolable? And so having the loud music, and having to shout to be heard, and having the space to just sit back
Hmm.
is a way to process that grieving of honoring the dead, and having a public event without having to perform yourself quite so much at a time where you're really grieving.
Yeah, the Western funeral. If there's anything I can do.
Yeah, and what else do you say, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I never know what to say. And so it's the in some ways you could grieve at home and with close loved ones, but if you want to commemorate the dead in a larger social setting, in some ways it takes a lot of pressure off. I think.
The people who are performing, so you mentioned that one woman who's sort of like an MC,
Hmm.
the just person guiding the program. Do they see themselves as part of a religious ritual, or are they entertainers, pure and simple?
I didn't see any talk to anyone involved in the business who really saw themselves as religious practitioners. I think they see themselves as entertainers and in a specific venue of entertainment. And for that matter, people who like watching them didn't really have a lot to say about the meaning of this in religious spectrum. Now, if you talk to anthropologists, they'll wax poetic about how sexuality and fertility is a
Ah,
counterpoint to death, So it's a
Yes, yes.
regeneration. There are a lot of symbols and I'm not saying that's wrong. There are a lot of symbols embedded. See what I did there? It's ba-dum-bum. Uh, but but I think those symbols are what in anthropology would be called an edic, outside analysis, rather than emic, inside worldview. I think the inside worldview, um, it is at religious events, but it is not a religious activity. I think that's how most people would frame it in Taiwan.
It's
It's a good question, though.
if I had to dissect it, I would say this is basically gangsters sending each other off with a bang. That's how it
Yeah.
started.
I mean, I think that's exactly how it started. I think that's right. And then from there, gangsters are gangsters, but they have a lot of money, and there's a lot of prestige within that culture. You think about American love of gangster movies. We love to fantasize about this, right? And some of their behavior and dress codes may have kind of blended into the rest of society, bled into a larger ethos about behavior and tipping, for example.
Do they try
But
to outdo each other?
yeah, absolutely. But I think these days, I wouldn't say it's a gangster thing. It's a very mainstream thing. But there's absolutely a lot of competition. I went to an event a couple of years ago where there were, I'm trying to count in my head. There were 4 different stage cars. These diesel truck versions of electric power cars. And the audience wasn't enough to be absolutely full for all of them. So the audience was almost like watching a fish or a flock of birds, a school of fish or a flock of birds, go from one food source to the other. If one stage was doing something more interesting, suddenly the entire crowd was in front of that one stage. And then the other stage would try to get louder or take off a little bit more or do something. And then that audience would flow back to them. It was really interesting seeing that. I mean, they've always been competitive, but I've never seen it so visually obvious. Usually, what I saw, they were distanced a little bit, like a half a block or a block away from each other. And so there might be a temple event that spanned several blocks, several temples involved. And so the competition is more about where you are locally. They tended to put the best performers central and the new performers out in the periphery where only a few people would see. But at this particular event, man, they were, you could see them eyeballing other stages and saying, how do I get my audience back? It was, I felt for them, actually. It was a lot of pressure.
So why hasn't this tradition extended into Ghost Month? I mean, we could have a whole month of
Yeah.
erotic dancing.
I mean, I think it does. Ghost Month, New Year, these big events. It's a big presence actually. Here too, it's not something you or I might see because we might be in more urban environments. But yeah, these events, Guan Ying's birthday is another, Mazu's birthday. These religious moments, they're very much a part of that celebration, I think. And Ghost Month is another great example of hot and noisy ethos, right? Even taking electric flower cars out of the procession, again, some of the stuff in the documentary with these hundreds of kids doing these almost spinning tops with string. There were belly dancers. They weren't electric flower cars. There was all kinds of visual spectacle. There were men doing kind of martial arts prowess, dressed up like the Monkey King or other famous either religious or literary figures, or both, often like the Monkey King. So I think this overall celebration is so much wider than any one thing, but it's exactly at events like New Year's or Ghost Month that they're in very, very high demand, actually.
I've been all over Taiwan, including some very rural places, but somehow where were you
Yeah,
exactly.
well, I think often I would again I would call the manager and say, when are you performing next? This was all over. I saw the older traditional kind of electric flower car. I saw a couple years ago at a very very small funeral procession in a remote area of Pingdong, where my wife is from that area. I've seen them in Taipei County, just outside city limits. I've seen them uh, really all over. I think the most common, though, are small towns in central and southern Taiwan, and actually northern as well. Small towns, though, little villages. And the villages is maybe overstating, but little towns where uh, it takes a little bit to get to them. I went to a couple performances uh, pretty recently that you go to a train station, then you have to take a taxi because buses have all shut down. And as somebody who spent most of my time in Tainan and Taipei, that was unthinkable. The idea of a public transportation system that at 8 o'clock stopped, right? That you had to have your own car or motorcycle, and even taxis. I had I almost got stranded on the side of the street getting home because it was so remote. Even taxis kind of stopped working around 8 o'clock there. So I think that's why uh, people like you and me maybe don't stumble on it quite as much without actively looking for it. Because me too, I've been all over, but I hadn't been that remote. I thought I had been all over, but I'd really, my idea of all over was much more, hang out in Tainan, get some good food, or go to Kaohsiung, go to a temple, go to Kunming, hang out at the beach. But I mean, as far as people living in farm areas, farming communities, which are primarily pretty elderly at this point, and then their children and their grandchildren might drive in from whatever city they're at to participate in these events. That's why I think a lot of urbanites just don't see it so much. It's out there though.
We will have to have a separate discussion about haunting fetus. Is that right? The name?
Yeah, yeah,
That's
uh,
a fascinating
yeah.
thing that you looked at.
It is. I guess whether I've done subjects justice or not, I'll leave that to readers. But I think I have been pretty good at finding topics that nobody else wanted to deal with as anthropologists. Things that were a little bit scandalous. There too, though. I think as I got to know it, I was surprised. I was much more empathetic to the practice once I got to know the basic frameworks. And
Hmm.
in a quick and easy, simplistic rendition of this whole thing, I think looking at the U.S., there are two political camps that are very extreme: pro-life, pro-choice. Neither term does the subject justice. Neither leaves room for somebody in the middle, somebody who's had abortions but feels bad about it, feels guilty about it. And I think the practice in Taiwan of funeral ghost appeasement gives women, especially, a chance to say, I feel bad about this, but I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to rectify a situation. I'm going to pray for this aborted fetus to go on to its next life. So at these basic levels, I think it was a kind of very life affirming way for religious belief to discourage abortion, but to do it in a way that didn't demonize the people involved.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have that judgmental sort of attitude that you find in especially America.
I think so. I mean, in America, of course, there's a long history of this. It's very much wrapped up into Christian values. I was reading a book. I think it was called Wrath of Angels that was talking about when abortion was first made uh, illegal in the U.S. And this was I forget. I think early 1900s, something like that. The discourse wasn't about the fetus's right to live. It was about the worry that mothers were dying from abortions. And at that time, even if they went to a real doctor, a lot of women were dying from the procedure. And then the other thing, which I didn't know, there was a prevalent concern among Protestants that they were going to be taken over by Catholics who had too many children. So I think in the U.S., I'm sympathetic to this worry that it's life, you're killing life, and I don't want to discount that completely, but I think historically there were a lot of issues that was the impetus of this movement that maybe it's been lost to history.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think in Taiwan, I don't want to present it as being an easy decision anywhere. I think people are guilt-ridden and people do feel bad about it. But I think there's
Nobody
certainly
wants to do this. Nobody is jumping up
yeah.
down for
No,
joy.
I think that there is a misperception that people just don't care, but I think you're right. There's no religious equivalent to, for example, I had friends in the 1980s who got abortions, college classmates and such, and they had to walk through a gauntlet where people were shouting at them they were going to hell as they went in to get an abortion. And that I think Taiwan has always been a little bit more respectful about other people's choices. And it's a weird tension because Americans pride themselves on individualism, but we're so concerned with what other people do.
Yeah.
Whereas Taiwanese pride themselves on community orientation, but if it's outside the family, their community is family, right? And if it's outside the family, there's just never been the level of concern about abortion or LGBTQ behavior or any of this stuff, right? And so it's
You can eat
interesting.
meat, not eat meat. You can go to this temple or
Yeah.
that temple. Just nobody really cares.
Yeah, well, and you raise a good point. People go to this temple or that temple. There's because of polytheism, the belief in many deities. There's a lot more mixing and matching that goes on. The same family might go to a Confucian temple to pray for their children to get into college, and then later go to a Taoist temple, which is really syncretic, right? It's mixing all kinds of things from Buddhism and Taoism and Buddhism and even Christianity in there. And then, if they get sick, they might go to both of these temples, and they might go to a Chinese practitioner of traditional medicine, and they might go to they probably start out with a Western hospital these days.
What I also like about Taiwan is, although they will probably go to the temple, you don't have the equivalent of the people who are going to only stick to faith healing.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think people are very rational to the degree that they're saying, I'm going to try this, and if that doesn't work, I'm going to try this other thing, and they'll go until they kind of get some resolution in this. In the old days, they used to call it placebo effect. The idea that maybe people really do get better because they think going to the temple makes them better. I think these days they talk about something called regression to the mean. It's the same idea that in most cases, if you're sick, you're going to get better over time. Our bodies are miraculous things. Not all cases. We have cancer and these other things that are, terminal. But in most cases, you get the flu or you injure yourself. After a couple of years, you're going to be back on your feet. And so then it becomes a matter of what can the community do to make that person less stressed, which will ease in their healing. And going to temples is one way. There too, it's an edict outsider point of view. The insider point of view is no, going to temples helps. And who are we to say that's wrong, really?
So before I let you go, what do you hope that when foreigners, I say foreigners, but international people, they see this documentary, or just in general with your work, what are you hoping that they would learn or take away for the biggest lessons?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the goal has always been find out how wonderfully varied the human race is, right? That we think of one thing as natural, but in fact, we have all kinds of ways of handling the same situations. But there's this common level of humanity under it all. And two, I think equally importantly, it forces us to look in a mirror and say, why do we do what we do? Why do we assume this is right and that is wrong? And try to put that away. And I think there's room to say, okay, I don't like strippers either because, as you mentioned, understandable objections about the role models this provides of putting women in as objectified commodities in the public eye, or as a more conservative viewpoint of, I just don't think this is a moral act that we should be inflicting on women and children. Uh, so on all sides of this debate, I think we need to take a step back and say, okay, well, I don't get it, but why do they do it? And what does this say about them? And what does this say about me that I'm having this reaction to this?
Very interesting. And we're going to put a link to the documentary, of course, in the show notes. And you're planning to soon perhaps chop it up into smaller, like shorts.
Yeah, I'm hoping to do shorts. I'm also working on a book. So I'm hoping to publish a book that goes into depth about some of these issues. I made the documentary specifically for classroom use. So it's 40 minutes, which is, I think, been very nice for me and other professors. But it does mean a lot gets lost in the cracks. And so I'm hoping this book will expand and have a larger discussion and also maybe include this discussion of what comes out in cultural studies of visual and what comes out in cultural studies in the written form. But yeah, I'm also hoping to create some 5-minute clips to be more amenable to today's attention spans in the internet age, for sure, for sure.
Yes. Well, speaking of attention spans, I think we've reached our listeners' limit. So thank you so much for coming on Formosa Files. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I think your questions really drew out a wonderful conversation, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness and seeing the film and kind of bouncing ideas off of what I'm trying to do here. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.